Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our November 20th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today's episode features a winter weather forecast by ag climatologist Dr. Dennis Todey, as well as a deep dive conversation about California's Prop 12 law with Iowa Farm Bureau economist Dr. Christopher Pudenz. And at the end of this episode, we'll give you an opportunity to learn even more about the implementation and impacts of Prop 12 during a market study tour to Sacramento next spring. Members participating in that tour will hear from the California farmers, meat distributors, food retailers, researchers, and ag experts who know it well. And again, you'll hear more about the California Market Study Tour at the end of this episode. But we'll start with Dr. Dennis Todey, an ag climatologist and the director of USDA's Midwest Climate Hub. What's the weather outlook for the winter and early spring months? And will there be enough precipitation to take a bite out of the drought conditions plaguing our state? Spokesman reporter Bob Bion asked those questions and more in a recent call with Dr. Dennis Todey.
Welcome, Dennis. Would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about the Midwest Climate Hub?
Sure. I'm Dr. Dennis Todey. I'm the director of the USDA Midwest Climate Hub, originally an Iowan from southern Iowa. Spent a couple of my tours here. This is my third tour through Ames. My background is as a meteorologist, ag climatologist, whatever hat I need to wear that day. I've got training in all those. Now, about the Midwest Climate Hub itself, we are a part of USDA, and we sit in Ames on the campus at Iowa State in what's called the National Laboratory for Agriculture and the Environment. Some old-time Iowa State folks may remember it as the National Soil Tilth Lab. Same building, same kind of work going on here. I came here 7 years ago, and the hub was established actually about 10 years ago in February. And our goal is to help agriculture deal with climate issues, changing climate issues at all time scales. Real-time issues like drought, like we're going to talk about today, and longer-term changes, those impacts, and how agriculture can help mitigate some of those issues.
Yeah, so on that note, kind of as we sit here today, Iowa continues to experience drought conditions that have been ongoing for the past few years. How about explaining how we got here in our current situation?
We are experiencing something that can happen in the Midwest where we have extended dry periods. We can go back and look at some back in the 50s, the 30s particularly, and there are some historically beyond that looking back at tree rings. But we've not experienced anything like this in some time. So we have a multi-year drought where we have maybe just enough rainfall for crop production, but generally a widespread lack of rainfall. And the other part of that is what we call evapotranspiration. Some of the heat during the summertime particularly, we're transpiring and evaporating more water from the surface. So that combination is leading to the serious drought conditions that we're experiencing around the state and around the Midwest. Much of the Midwest has had some version of drought this summer. Unfortunately, Iowa was kind of the center of it in the latter part of the summer and still is right now.
So the latest drought monitor shows some improving conditions in the short term. Some places got some rain in Iowa, but most of the state remains in moderate to extreme drought. Where are we seeing the worst conditions in Iowa?
If you look on the drought monitor, the worst conditions are the D3, which is extreme drought, over most of the eastern part of the state. And that really has developed during the latter part of summer. The western and southern part of the state are in lesser levels of drought, but still drought there. Northwest is actually one of the areas that's in better conditions right now. They've had more late season rainfall and some late summer rainfalls, particularly up around the Spencer area. So I don't think things are wet up there, but they are certainly better than some of the other areas. If you're looking for some of the more specific drought issues, there are some pockets around the state where we're getting into water issues. Osceola is one area that I've had information passed on to me where their reservoir is reaching critical levels. They're trying to figure out what to do with. And I think there are some other pockets that way. And that's part of the thing we have to remember about drought too, is there's different components of it. There's part that affects agriculture. There's parts that affect water supply, groundwater, all these kinds of things we need to take into account when we're dealing with drought.
How much moisture do you think we actually need? What's it going to take for us to break out of this drought position we're in? Obviously, we're going to need a bunch.
Yeah. And that's always the tough call, is understanding how much rainfall you need. It varies, again, based on those types of different issues related to drought. From an agriculture perspective, the first thing we're probably thinking of is getting water back in our soils. If we look at what happened this last summer, we were kind of skirting the edge of having enough moisture to kind of get us throughout most of the state through the year. And then the couple heat events in the latter parts of the summer, August and around Labor Day, really kind of hit us, and that kind of ended the growing season because of a combination of heat and just running out of moisture in our soils. So we can probably assume over most of the state soils down to that 5 foot level or so, we're pretty much devoid or lacking any plant available water. So to get those back refilled to field capacity would take 10 to 12 inches of water getting into the soil, 10 to 12 inches of liquid getting into the soil to get it back to field capacity. Now, we don't need 10 to 12 inches of water to say we're out of drought. We wouldn't say we're in drought completely, but to get us back where we'd want to be by the time next growing season comes around, we'd like to get that much water in the soils. Now, if we have rainfall, recent rainfalls have generally been pretty good about most of the water going into the soil. There's not been too much runoff, but we can't assume that all the time. There's always going to be a little bit of runoff. So that's the minimum we're going to try to get at. For those areas where we have surface water problems, like reservoirs or streams where we're getting low stream flows, we need to produce runoff. We need to produce consistent runoff to be able to fill those up. And recent rainfalls have been decent with adding moisture back in the soil, but we need to get runoff. And then the groundwater issues, again, we need more water to be able to get in those places to replenish groundwater. So we're short in some places 20 to 24 inches of water over the last 2 years. Now, we don't need 20 to 24 inches to say we're out of drought, but we need to be in the teens of liquid water somewhere between now and the beginning of next growing season to where we'd say we're feeling pretty good at this point.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about streams and stream flows. There's been a lot of talk about the low stream flows, and particularly the low Mississippi River. So where do we stand with flow on the Mississippi, and what's that going to take to improve?
Doing a little looking at where we are on stream flows, where we are on the Mississippi along Iowa, Illinois, I think things are low, but they're passable. The problem areas are still further south. Once you get south of where the Ohio comes in and those areas down towards the lower end of the Mississippi. And that is because the drought areas, I mentioned, much of the Midwest has been very dry this year to the point where streams all across the upper Midwest are not producing a lot of water that flows into the river system that eventually reaches the Mississippi. The other part about that is that down below Cairo, Illinois, which is that bottom tip of Illinois where the Ohio comes in, actually the Ohio contributes more to the flow below that than the Mississippi does. And dryness in the eastern Corn Belt is limiting flows along the Ohio too. So that combination is leading to a lack of water in the river. So there's still low flow problems further south. Corps of Engineers, I know, is working on that to try to keep things moving. I think things are still moving, though they're not loading as much, and maybe limiting barge traffic. And I think numbers of barges and tows also. So things are able to keep moving, but they're still on that edge. Now we're kind of at a point where climatologically we start getting less precipitation throughout the late fall into winter. On that offside, there's not a lot of active growing, so there's some beginning to accumulate more water in the soil, which can lead to more runoff. So I don't think we're going to see a big improvement quickly, but there are indications that we will get into a more active pattern, not up here as much, but further south, and that would help out the stream flows down there.
So we're all kind of thinking, what's winter going to bring? What are the forecast models showing for us?
Okay. And when we're looking at winter, there's several things that we can look at to give us indications about what an upcoming month or season particularly might look like. The first of those is where are we with El Nino and La Nina, because those are our best indicators for different seasons. And then trend. Are there recent trends that we can point to? And El Nino, La Nina is the strongest of these. So the first thing we're looking at right now, if people have been listening to the news at all, we are in an El Nino. And when we're talking about El Nino, we're talking about ocean temperatures along the equatorial Pacific. If you would look at a map of temperatures in the central Pacific Ocean, you'd see this dark area extending from South America to the west that would be much warmer than average. That's indicative of an El Nino. And in our situation right now, we have a very strong El Nino. We don't think it's going to reach record levels, but it is already strong and likely to stay strong throughout the winter. So what does that mean for us? In the upper Midwest, the stronger signal is that we're more likely to be warmer than average. The first indication, and that's kind of what we're seeing so far, is generally warmer than average conditions. We did have that cold a couple weeks ago. That's our first bout of cold, and it was a pretty good bout of cold. But now we look to be staying on the warmer side for a while here again. Don't see another major cold event, at least for a couple weeks right now. And that is also consistent with El Nino and trend being tending for warmer winters. So a better chance of being warmer than average this winter. Now, does that mean we won't have cold? No, we'll still have cold. Some of it could be particularly nasty. But generally, if you take the winter overall as a whole, it's more likely warmer than average. So our cold events will probably be fewer of them and weaker. So that would be the take-home message. The tougher one is what happens in the way of precipitation. Precipitation is always a harder one to deal with. There was a recent article put out by some NOAA folks who looked at a number of El Nino events around the country and what they do. And the likelihood over Iowa is that we will have less snowfall overall. It's not a guarantee, but if you look at previous El Ninos, we tend to have less snow. Now, does that mean we'll be drier? Not necessarily. And in fact, if you look at the outlooks and some other recent El Nino events, particularly as you get later in the winter, we actually have slightly increased chances for precipitation. So I'm saying, okay, less snow, but there's more precipitation. What does that tell you? Maybe more rainfall rather than snowfall. And depending on what surface conditions are like, that might not be a bad thing for agriculture, getting more of this as rainfall instead of snowfall. Because snowfall, we don't tend to add as much moisture to soils with snowfall as we do with rainfall.
Any idea what past El Nino events have done in Iowa? When were the last ones that we've had, and how do they compare to what we might see this year?
Sure. We track those and we scale them by their strength, by how warm the sea surface temperatures are in the Pacific. The stronger the El Nino, the more likely these conditions are to occur. So we talked about the chances for warmer. We have a better chance for warmer, and the chances for precipitation increase also. Now, that doesn't mean every El Nino is going to look exactly like that. Our last major El Nino was 2015, I believe. We had another one about 5 years ago. So they don't all look exactly the same, but there are these commonalities towards warmer and more likely more precipitation, though not a guarantee. One other factor that comes into play often with El Ninos that is not talked about is that the jet streams around us, we tend to have a jet stream to our north and to our south. Oftentimes when we have El Ninos, those tend to split, and we get in a period where we get kind of murky weather. There's not much going on, not much happening. So there's a chance that we could get into a midwinter where, depending on what our cloud cover is like, we might see some kind of murky weather. There was a famous one back in the early 90s, 91, 92, where Ames had an extended stretch. Well, central Iowa had an extended stretch of cloud cover that for about a 2 to 3 week period, we were locked in clouds and didn't have a whole lot of rainfall, but it's kind of murky conditions. Again, not a guarantee it's going to happen, but something we may watch out for as the winter goes along.
Well, you talked a little bit about the possibility of a strong El Nino event and maybe not so much now, but there's been some talk about that. So what would that mean as compared to a regular El Nino event for Iowa?
Sure. We categorize them based on how much different from average their sea surface temperatures are in the Pacific. And the stronger the El Nino, the more likely the conditions are to happen, the typical El Nino conditions. So just a better chance of those happening rather than weaker conditions. The main focus of where the El Nino is in the Pacific Ocean, the central to eastern Pacific Ocean. That's quite some distance from us. So for conditions to change there and those to translate up to us, there's lots of things that can happen in between in the way the jet stream works and other intervening issues. So we don't have hard and fast correlations with what El Ninos look like, but El Ninos, especially during the wintertime, are probably our best bet at being able to look multiple months in advance and say, here's what conditions are likely to be.
What would be the most ideal situation we could see this winter weather-wise to help Iowa's farmers as they look toward planting season next spring? Obviously, we want some precipitation and we want it to stick around.
Part of that, again, depends on what part of agriculture you're involved with. If you want more moisture back in the soils, we want that warmer winter, so soils may not freeze, and then get some rainfalls that can get water back in the soils. If you do livestock and you have to deal with livestock, that would lead to muddy conditions, and you wouldn't be as happy about that. From a soil moisture perspective, that would probably be our best case scenario at getting water back in the soils. If you need surface water, that's not going to help surface water. If we need surface water, then it would actually be better that we get a couple big snowfalls and we get some big runoff from those big snowfalls. It's not saying we can't have an El Nino and still have those, because those are individual events that are a little bit hard to project. But your first point is correct. We just need water in some form to help us out. And climatologically, we're not going to recover out of drought in the wintertime. We can't get enough moisture to really improve our drought conditions. If we were in weaker drought conditions, maybe we could get enough to improve that. But the severity of drought that we have, we may be able to improve it a little bit. We will not eliminate it this winter. There's just not a way of doing that. Our best opportunities to eliminate drought conditions or greatly improve that will come late winter, early spring, when climatologically we start getting more precipitation.
Yeah, let's wrap up with this. Maybe a best summary of what we could expect this winter, and maybe a few words, maybe 3 or 4 words of what farmers can expect.
Sure. More likely warmer than average, with intermittent cold that will still occur. More likely more precipitation later in the winter, early spring. Unfortunately, it's not going to alleviate drought conditions, but hopefully we can at least cut into some of those drought conditions.
Thanks, Dr. Todey. When you're facing drought conditions like these, there's just no quick or easy answer. But let's hope that Dr. Todey's guarded projection about more precipitation in the late winter and early spring brings us some of that relief that we're all looking for. Next up is a challenging new law that we've been talking about for years now, and unfortunately, it goes into effect in just a few weeks. Of course, I'm talking about California's Proposition 12 law. Even now, just weeks away from implementation, there are so many unanswered questions about the impacts of this burdensome law, and that's not likely to change anytime soon. With that in mind, Iowa Farm Bureau Economics and Research Manager Dr. Christopher Pudenz is organizing a market study tour to Sacramento in the spring of 2024, which will give Iowa farmers like you a chance to receive updates and insight about Prop 12 from the California food and ag stakeholders who are right there on the front lines. Here with more on the tour is Dr. Christopher Pudenz with spokesman reporter Corey Munson.
Thanks for joining me, Christopher. Early next year, you're planning to lead a market study trip to California. Why did Iowa Farm Bureau choose California as the destination for next year's market study trip?
California was chosen because of the state's Proposition 12, often called just Prop 12, which is a law being implemented as we speak that will impact many hog producers in the state of Iowa. Prop 12 puts in place specific arbitrary requirements regarding production practices for pork sold in California, and it was voted into law by Californians all the way back in 2018 as a ballot measure. Practically, it dictates how breeding hogs can be housed in other states, including Iowa. Full implementation will begin on January 1, 2024, so just a few months from now. And we want to provide Iowa hog producers and allies with the opportunity to travel to California to learn about how this law will be implemented and what the implications will be for the hog operations back home here in Iowa.
So when is the tour going to take place, and can you tell us about the businesses and organizations you'll be meeting with?
The tour is March 18th through 21, 2024, and it's going to be a busy trip. We fly out at 6 a.m. on a Monday morning, and we return to Des Moines late Thursday evening. We'll spend the week in the Sacramento area meeting with as many different stakeholders as possible, including our counterpart, California Farm Bureau. We'll also meet with farmers and representatives from processors, wholesalers, and retailers. And we have a tour of Port of Oakland lined up, which is an important port for exporting meats to the Asian markets. The thought is that we want to get as many perspectives as we possibly can on the practical implementations of the policy that is Prop 12. So we are really trying to cover the whole supply chain from beginning to end. And then finally, on the last day, we'll meet with the California Department of Food and Agriculture, CDFA, which would be their version of our IDOLs here in Iowa. CDFA is the entity charged with implementing Prop 12, so I'm looking forward to that meeting because I hope that we'll be able to get some direct answers straight from the source for our producers and the members that are on the trip.
Now, can you talk through a little bit more through this Prop 12 issue? Why is it such a big issue, especially for Iowa farmers, and why was it chosen as the focal point of this trip?
We chose to study Prop 12 for this market study tour for two reasons. The first is timing. Prop 12 goes fully into effect on January 1. Like I mentioned, Californians approved Prop 12 all the way back in 2018, but it has been more or less tied up in court since then. The case made it all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, but in a somewhat surprising and messy decision, it was preserved in a 5-4 ruling this past spring, and Prop 12 now can go into implementation. California courts have postponed complete implementation until January 1, but as we know right now, when we hit January 1, Prop 12 will be fully in effect. So, a trip to Sacramento in March will occur just a few months after the January 1 implementation date, which gets our members out there after the implementation, so hopefully some of those wrinkles will get ironed out and we'll be able to get some solid answers. But we can get them those answers in time to help make decisions back on their operations about whether or not they want to implement some of the requirements going forward. So that's reason number one. Reason number two is that Prop 12 impacts Iowa hog production specifically because Iowa has the largest breeding herd in the country, and we want to provide our members with the opportunity to learn about how this could impact the breeding herd here in the state.
It seems like there might be some challenges associated with really implementing this policy. What's your take on that issue?
Yeah, there are many challenges that flow from implementing this policy, and for sake of discussion, I'll put them in three separate but related groups. The first set of challenges has to do with consistency, or perhaps I should say lack of consistency, in the way that Prop 12 is written. For example, Prop 12 applies to whole, uncooked pork, such as bacon, but believe it or not, Prop 12 does not apply to breakfast sausage that could be made from pork. For another example, Prop 12 applies to all pork sold in California, but it does not apply to pork that is transshipped through California to be exported through their ports there. This is good news for the pork industry since such a large proportion of pork exports leave the U.S. via ports in California, but it creates its own set of logistical headaches that still have to be worked through. Which leads us to the next category of challenges, which are those related to certification. All pork sold in California will have to be Prop 12 certified. This means that someone will have to travel to every sow farm producing piglets that eventually become pork bound for California and certify that that sow farm is Prop 12 compliant. And pork that is transshipped through California will have to be labeled as not for sale in the state if it is not Prop 12 certified. Just think of the time and energy that all of this is going to require, and then all the paperwork on top of it too. And finally, the last set of challenges has to do with increased costs, which include those associated with this paperwork, but also those associated with converting non-compliant buildings or constructing entirely new compliant buildings in order to adhere to this policy.
You mentioned before that California Farm Bureau will be among the groups that you'll be visiting with. Obviously, they've been at the front lines of this Prop 12 controversy. So what is it that you hope to learn from California Farm Bureau? Kind of what is the insights that they're bringing to this process?
Yes, we'll be meeting with them right away as soon as we arrive in California. And this is intentional because we want to learn from them and also support them. They've been in the trenches fighting this thing, so they know more about the policy than anybody. For example, what conversations have they been having with farmers, with grocers, with CDFA officials? What issues with implementation have they already solved that we haven't yet solved here out in Iowa? And what other issues have they encountered or thought of that we haven't even thought of yet? So we want to glean as much from them as we possibly can, and we also want to support them. California Farm Bureau doesn't like Prop 12 any more than we do. So they're an invaluable ally to us, with boots on the ground, just like we're an ally to them on other issues.
Who among our membership do you think this market study trip would appeal to? Kind of, who are you targeting?
The market study tour to California appeals to a couple different groups of members. For starters, this tour appeals to Iowa hog producers who have already taken or are considering taking the necessary steps to sell Prop 12 compliant pork into California. There are so many challenges and so much uncertainty associated with compliance and certification, and we want to provide these members with the best possible firsthand information that we can in order to aid them in their decision making. This tour also appeals to folks who are in allied agribusiness who may have to comply with Prop 12 in the way that they handle and ship pork. And then finally, this group appeals to any Farm Bureau member who is concerned about overregulation in agriculture broadly and what it could mean for their farm. This trip will provide this last group with a great opportunity to learn more about these pressures and to talk to farmers in California who deal with these pressures day in and day out.
Now, one of the components of these market study trips in the past has been knowledge sharing, both during the trip itself among the participants as well as once Iowa Farm Bureau members return home. Can you kind of talk us through what that knowledge sharing is, how it's implemented, and kind of what the value of it is?
This knowledge sharing is critical, and in my opinion, it's one of the main reasons we even do market study tours at all. One requirement for being selected for the tour is that participants must give 3 informational presentations when they return home from the tour. This helps pass along that local knowledge even further and adds even more value to trips like these. Examples of this type of presentation could be a presentation to the County Farm Bureau during their monthly meeting, or a presentation to a group at the local library. Last year, we had somebody do an interview with a local media news outlet. And so this just provides a chance for that knowledge to be shared 1 degree further. There are things about Prop 12 and the California regulatory environment more broadly that would simply be impossible for us to learn without traveling there. Stakeholders in California have local knowledge that would be useful for us to know, but this knowledge doesn't likely ever make it to the internet, and if it ever does, we wouldn't likely even know where to search for it. Similarly, there are things that hog producers know about raising hogs that other people not in the industry simply don't know. But market study tours like this one provide the perfect environment for knowledge sharing to take place. And I fully expect that we will experience this knowledge sharing when we go out to Sacramento.
Any other details that we need to know, like the number of participants that are eligible to take this trip, kind of what the deadlines are, maybe costs associated with it?
We're going to take about 20 Iowa Farm Bureau members total, with applications due by December 14th. Applicants will be notified regarding selection decisions by January 4th, and then between then and March 18th, we'll have 2 required pre-trip briefings virtually, where you just learn more information about the trip and get prepared before we leave. The cost of the trip is $850, which includes airfare, lodging, and most food, and personally, I think that's a really good deal. In regard to participation requirements, other than being Iowa Farm Bureau members in good standing, the requirements include those 3 post-trip presentations I mentioned, as well as participation in the 2 pre-trip virtual briefings that I mentioned. And then finally, participants must have the ability to walk for periods of time as might be required by trip activities.
Well, just to wrap up then, can you tell me, how do members find out more about the market study trip and how do they sign up?
More information about the market study tour is available on the Iowa Farm Bureau website, where we've provided an overview of the trip and also an abridged itinerary. From there, it's possible to use your Iowa Farm Bureau credentials to log in and apply for the trip right there on the website. I suggest filling out the application on a computer because there are several questions that require lengthier answers, and it might be a little difficult to type out those answers on a phone. And finally, if you have any specific questions, you can reach out to the email that's listed there on the website, and we'll get answers back to you as quickly as we can. Just as a final pitch, I really do encourage anyone who is interested in this trip to apply. The participants on last year's trip really enjoyed themselves, and I fully expect the same to be true this year. It'll definitely be a business trip. We'll stay busy the entire time because we have a lot to accomplish in a relatively short period. But the participants will learn a lot and will definitely be home before the weekend. So please do apply and reach out if you have any more questions.
If you raise hogs here in Iowa, this tour is definitely one that you'll want to consider. As you just heard Christopher say, there's no good substitute for the kinds of answers you'll get by asking the food and ag stakeholders who have been in the trenches dealing with this issue for years. To learn more about our market study tour and to apply for a chance to join it, check out the link in the notes for this episode or head out to iowafarmbureau.com. That's all for this episode of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you found it insightful and that you'll join us early next month for a special series of podcast episodes that we're releasing on December 4th, 5th, and 6th. Those episodes will feature 3 young Iowa farmers who have earned recognition for their outstanding leadership accomplishments in recent years. If you're looking for a dose of inspiration and 3 great examples of the impact that individual farmers can have when they answer the call to lead, you'll definitely want to tune in. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.